our Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It's good to be back today, and I'm sorry to have missed last week. I was struck down by COVID, as many people have been, and I'm hardly feeling at my most dynamic this morning. The trouble is, some people won't be able to spot the difference, but never mind. We're continuing our series in the Highway of Holiness, the message of 1 Corinthians for today, and we come now to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where we consider the subject together of marriage. And there's been a bit of a common theme, hasn't there, recently? We thought some time ago about sexual immorality and what Paul was writing about there, when we thought about the context and the culture in which the church in Corinth was based. Now we're thinking about marriage today. Next week we'll continue our series and come on to other things, but today it's the subject of marriage. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we're going to read verses 1 to 16. And so Paul writes, "Now for the matters you wrote about. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent, and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do, but if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And her husband must not divorce his wife. For the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is they are holy. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Amen. Whatever were we thinking when we thought this would be worth preaching on this morning? I wondered as I was preparing this, and perhaps you thought as we heard this morning as well. These are controversial issues within our day and age, aren't they? But they were controversial issues in Paul's day too. And if we don't preach on these things, then other agendas will shape the way we think. And isn't it right that we should grapple with what the Bible says and allow that to shape our lives instead? What if it is not true? Do you ever think about that? Do you ever have doubts about it all? What if it is all just not true? I don't mean our Christian faith. There are always doubts from time to time. The Bible is very honest about that, very encouraging about that. I mean the beliefs that the world pushes at us so confidently all the time. The beliefs that surround us so much that we end up just assuming that they must be true because we hear them so much, and everyone seems to believe them. What if it's not true? Our subject for today, as we continue this Highway of Holiness series, is marriage. And just think about some of the beliefs about marriage and related subjects that surround us in our wider culture. Over the last 60 years or so, we've come through what has been called a sexual revolution. Jason, we might need to just slam that door, otherwise I think it's going to come off. It hinges, if you please. Thank you very much. I'll just pause whilst we have a slam. There we go. Thank you very much. A sexual revolution has swept our world in the last 60 years or so. It made some amazing promises, most especially the promise of freedom, of liberation. But think for a moment of where it has brought us. Statistics show that despite all the bravado, adults are engaging in meaningful sexual intimacy within relationships less than ever before. If the stats were to continue present trends, within a couple of decades, it is said, hardly any children will be born at all by natural methods. Now, that's probably unlikely. It will probably level out at some stage. But the promise was for more freedom, for liberation in sexual activity. You can indulge in it whenever you like, with whomever you like. The result? Far less sexual intimacy than ever before. With fewer people marrying, and the rising levels of divorce or breakup after cohabitation, direct consequences of this sexual revolution, there are more adults, especially in their middle-aged years, living alone with correspondingly greater levels of loneliness. The promise, liberation. The result, loneliness. But it's the effects of it all upon children, the most vulnerable members of our society, that are most troubling of all. Now, of course, people find themselves in situations that they would never have chosen. And in the end, a healthy and happy childhood can be achieved in all sorts of situations, but the evidence is clear. Children raised by their two biological parents in a stable marriage do better on average against almost every measurable outcome, physically, cognitively, emotionally, than children raised in any other family structure. There are two ingredients. The two biological parents in a stable marriage. And this isn't faith-based research, Christians trying to prove a point. This is what secular scientists are telling us based on the statistics. Why marriage and not cohabitation? Well, again, the statistics show that cohabitation is much less stable than marriage. If you cohabit and have a child before you are married, or, worse still, according to the statistics, if you have a child and continue to cohabit rather than marrying, you are far more likely to separate than if you wait until you are married before you have children. And therefore, your children are much more likely to be brought up in a one-parent family, usually without a father. More than a quarter of such fathers have no contact with their children whatsoever. And almost another quarter only see their children, they say, several times a year. And the principle of the statistics is that the resulting insecurity and instability are bad for children in almost every measurable way. And further studies suggest that is one of the key factors which contributes to the mental health crisis we now face. The promise was of liberation. The result has been insecurity and instability for children who end up paying the highest price for it. Now, this is not to condemn anyone. There will always be people who buck the trend. And whatever your upbringing and whatever your circumstances in life now, the Lord, by His grace, can help you overcome the difficulties. And who are we to judge why and how someone has ended up in the situations in which they live? That's not our place at all. And let's also be clear that people can deliver dreadful outcomes for children, even if they are married to their child's other biological parent. But we shouldn't ignore the reality of the world we live in. The so-called sexual revolution made great boasts, but it hasn't delivered on its promises. They are all empty. It's all bravado. Don't you believe it? Do you ever ask yourself whether all those beliefs that are promoted around us on a daily basis are true? Just look at where they've got us. And of course, in many ways, there's nothing new about the situation in which we live. As we've thought in previous weeks, ancient Corinth, where all these Christians lived to whom Paul wrote all those years ago, well, Corinth was filled with sexual immorality, and it had even crept into the church, so much so that some of the things the Christians were doing were worse than the things that were going on in the wider culture. Some of the Christians therefore, in Corinth, had gone to the opposite extreme. And they had written to Paul about what they were teaching, and Paul quotes their letter as he writes back to them. So chapter 7, verse 1, the first verse we read, "Now for the matters you wrote about," and then he quotes their own teaching, "it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." They'd gone to the opposite extreme, you see, and they were teaching that Christians should not have sexual relationships at all, not even within marriage. And just as we would want to say to our surrounding culture, look at what's really going on, see where your beliefs have got you. So Paul says in effect to them, well, look at what has been achieved. There was sexual immorality occurring even within the church. And so, although he agrees that it isn't a bad thing, might even be a good thing for Christians to avoid sexual relationships if they can control themselves, he recognizes that not everyone can, perhaps most people can't, and so he writes in verse 2, "But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband." And straight away, Paul aligns himself with the biblical understanding of marriage. Although all sorts of people teach all sorts of things, the biblical standard is clear. Marriage is the lifelong union of one man and one woman to the exclusion of all others, and the only appropriate context for sexual intimacy. And if we struggle to see that as an inherently good thing, part of God's good creation, which he has ordered for our good and for his glory, the greatest vision for life the world knows, then perhaps it shows how much we have been shaped by, perhaps even taken in by, the beliefs of the world around us. So let's look at what Paul teaches about marriage in this chapter, praying that the Lord would open our hearts and our minds to the glory and goodness of his word. There's something here for each of us, no matter our age and stage in life. And it seems to me there are 5 things we can draw out from it all. The place of sexual intimacy within marriage, the perspective of gifts, the preference for the single state, the permanence of marriage, and the partners who are unbelieving. They all begin with the letter P. The place, the perspective, the preference, the permanence, the partners. And there are other things that he writes about later in the chapter, but we'll focus on verses 1 to 16 so that we don't overrun our time this morning. So firstly, the place of sexual intimacy within marriage. Paul begins by correcting their own teaching. Whilst they might have been right in saying that it is better to live a single, celibate life if you can, and we'll come back to that, they were wrong to teach that people who were married should not engage in sexual intimacy with their spouse. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Sexual intimacy is an essential part of marriage, ordinarily speaking. Sometimes there are physical problems or illness that can prevent people, but there is an obligation that each marriage partner has towards the other in terms of this intimacy. In fact, the first 5 verses here are filled with commands. They are commands. The way that it's translated in the version that I've read here with the word should is a little bit soft. So if we were to translate them more clearly as commands, it would come across something like this. Verse 2, each man is to have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. Verse 3, the husband is to fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. Notice the language of duty there. This isn't an optional extra that is about pleasing yourself. Verse 5, do not deprive each other. Then he gives a possible exception and a further command, then come together again. The place for sexual intimacy is within marriage, and within marriage it has an essential place that is not to be neglected. And there's a wonderful mutuality that is about loving service and care. Just notice in passing what Paul writes in verse 4. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. That was unprecedented in the ancient world. It's just one of the ways the Bible speaks about the dignity of women. Nowhere else in that day was it said that a wife had any claim over her husband whatsoever. There is a mutual obligation. An obligation that neither party is to seek gain through demand or force, And notice also about the purpose of sexual intimacy within marriage that Paul writes about here. It has all sorts of roles to play. It joins a couple deeply together, not just physically, but in every way. It brings about the procreation of children. But the old words of the marriage service also spoke of another purpose. It seems very old-fashioned now. But if a man and a woman stood at the front of a church to be married, this was part of the description of marriage that was read at the start of the service. It is a remedy against sin and to avoid fornication. And that is what Paul is writing about here. That's how Paul begins these verses. Verse 2, since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and so on. And it's how he ends this first section in verse 5. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. He's not saying that you can't pray if you don't abstain, but he's saying that if for some reason you find it easier to focus on prayer by abstaining than do so. But then comes the command, then come together again, and the purpose for the command, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. There is a sin to flee from. And one of the ways the Lord has given us to flee from it is marriage. If you engage in sexual intimacy appropriately within marriage, Paul suggests, you are much less likely to engage in it inappropriately outside marriage. So Paul's first point, the place of sexual intimacy, its place is within marriage. And within marriage it has an essential place. Secondly, the perspective of gifts. Verse 7, I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. So Paul was himself, it seems, single. And that means that it was most likely that his wife had died. It was almost unheard of for a Jewish rabbi, as he was, not to marry. But having been widowed, he decided not to remarry, and he saw that as a gift that God had given him, a gift to remain celibate. And it was a gift he knew that God would give to others too, though he wished it would be given to more Christians. I wish that all of you were as I am. And that brings a new perspective to singleness, doesn't it? In both that ancient culture and in ours, singleness has often been viewed as less than the best. A state to be endured rather than to be embraced positively. People joke and say something like, well, I'm single by choice, it's just not my first choice. But Paul sees singleness as a gift. And when he writes about gifts, he's referring to spiritual gifts. We don't often list the gift of singleness alongside the gifts of wisdom and knowledge and faith and healing and discernment and so on, do we, when we speak about the gifts of the Spirit? But of course, Jesus, in whom we see the fullest expression of human life, was single. And he gives the same gift to some of his followers too. It's a very hard thing to do. But doesn't this mean that Christians who are not married should surely seek to lay down their own desires before the Lord and prayerfully consider whether this is a gift he is giving them? And each of us, whatever our state in life, should be careful that the way we think about these things and the way we speak about these things aligns with this perspective of gifts. And I read quite recently something that a Christian who is single has written about the way he feels when married Christians speak about their other half, leaving him wondering whether as a single man he's less than a whole. We need to be careful about the way we speak, don't we? Otherwise, our words will be rooted in a culture that is less than biblical. Well, not so. Jesus, who truly lived life in all its fullness, was single, and he gives the same gift to some who follow him. And Paul seems to be saying here, if God hasn't given you that gift of singleness, you better get married, and he will give you some other gift instead. The perspective of gifts, and that leads us on to the preference for the single state. And let's be clear, when he writes about remaining unmarried, he means being celibate. The only place for sexual intimacy is within marriage. Verse 8, now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. It is good for them. Now, this isn't a moral matter, that it is therefore wrong to marry, or that those who remain unmarried are in some way morally superior to those who marry. He's just saying that it is better for them to remain unmarried if they can. He's being pragmatic, something that he expands on later in the chapter. If you were to look on to verse 28, second half of verse 28, those who marry, he says, will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. And again in verses 32 to 34, I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord, but a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided, and he says the same about unmarried women. This is a pragmatic thing. If you remain single as a Christian, you will have far more freedom to devote yourself to the Lord's service than if you were married. Now, I spoke about at the beginning some of the consequences of this so-called sexual revolution, and how the rising divorce rates and the separation of those who have cohabited has led to growing isolation and loneliness for many people who find themselves single in their middle-aged years. Such singleness also seems to encourage all too easily the development of an unhelpful kind of independence and leading to self-centeredness. But you see, that's not the vision of singleness in the Christian life. The vision of the single Christian life is one of deeply rooted community within the church and within Christian friendship, and one of selfless service. The different visions are worlds apart. And with that Christian vision of singleness, there is a preference for the single state if God has given you that gift. And yet, Paul says, if the Lord hasn't given you that gift, it would be better to marry. And again, he's being pragmatic. Verse 9, but if you cannot control, if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. The preference for the single celibate state, what a contrast that is to the vision presented by our wider culture. Fourthly, the permanence of marriage. What if, after getting married, you start to think that you might have preferred the single state after all? Or that having experienced marriage, you think you might be able to control yourself outside of marriage more than you thought you might have been able to. What options are open to you? Well, Paul is very clear. He writes about the permanence of marriage. There is only one option open to you. There are some exceptions which we'll come to, but the only option is to remain married. Verses 10 and 11. To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. And when he writes that it isn't him giving this command, but the Lord, he means that this is a command that can be traced back directly to Jesus himself. You remember when Jesus was questioned about divorce in the Gospels, he referred back to Genesis chapter 2, and he said, haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Paul writes about the permanence of marriage because Jesus spoke about the permanence of marriage. And once a Christian has entered into marriage, they are not free to separate again. If they do separate, there are only two options, either to remain unmarried or to be reconciled to their original marriage partner. That is the norm, although there do seem to be exceptions. When Jesus spoke about the permanence of marriage, he gave the exception of adultery. And Paul will later write about being deserted by your spouse. And the Old Testament identifies abuse, all grounds on which divorce is permitted. So there are exceptional circumstances, but the Bible knows nothing of the approach of our contemporary culture in which divorce seems to have become the norm. The overriding message of the Bible in these matters is of the permanence of marriage. And finally, the partners who are unbelieving. Of course, Paul is writing to first-generation Christians who had been converted to Christ out of a pagan world. Very often people will have been married before they were converted, And when they converted, quite possibly their husband or wife didn't become a follower of Jesus as well at the same time. And so they found themselves, as Christians, married to an unbeliever. What were they to do? That's what Paul turns to address in the final verses that we've read this morning. Firstly, he underlines again the permanence of marriage. If you are married to an unbeliever and the unbeliever is content to continue in the marriage, you should not seek to separate. Verses 12 and 13, he says, "To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord." Now, that's not to say that it has any less authority. What he's saying is just that Paul, as an apostle, is working out the implications of Christian teaching, rather than tracing a command straight back to Jesus himself. This is still the teaching of the Bible. It still holds authority. "To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord, if any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her." And he says the same to the women. And then there are words which hopefully come as a wonderful comfort and reassurance to those who find themselves in such a situation, which can often be heartbreaking. He writes, verse 14, "For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy." What's he mean by Christian wives sanctifying unbelieving husbands and vice versa, and making children holy? He's not talking about eternal salvation here. Each person must make their own decision to trust Jesus. He's writing with his Jewish background in mind. Jews were forbidden from marrying non-Jews. And if they did, their marriage was viewed as unholy. And the Jew who entered into such a marriage was viewed as being unholy. And it was all viewed as being outside the blessing of God. And that's not the way it is, says Paul, for Christians who are married to unbelievers. It's not that you are made unholy by your marriage, but that you bring the Lord's blessing upon your marriage and upon your children. So do not lose heart. But, Paul goes on, verse 15, "If your unbelieving spouse deserts you, you are not bound to remain in the marriage. God has called us to live in peace, as much as it depends on us. But if your unbelieving spouse is content to remain married, do not lose hope. How do you know, wife," Paul writes, verse 16, "whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Do not lose hope. Through your loving witness within your marriage, you may lead your husband or your wife to the Lord." Keep hoping, keep praying, keep living graciously. But do know that Paul is writing to those who were already married when they became Christians, and therefore found themselves married to an unbeliever. He's not giving this as a reason for a Christian to marry an unbeliever, that by marrying them you might somehow help them to become a Christian. No, he makes it clear later in the chapter that if a Christian is to enter into a marriage, the person they marry, he writes at the end of verse 39, must belong to the Lord. So there's much more that could be said about marriage, and indeed Paul writes much more in other places, but here he writes about these 5 things to help these Christians in Corinth live Christian lives within a wider culture that was filled with sexual immorality. And because our wider culture isn't so different from theirs in this regard, surely there's much for us here too. The place of sexual intimacy within marriage, the perspective of gifts, the preference for the single state, the permanence of marriage, the partners who are unbelieving. These are very difficult issues on which to preach, because they are so hotly contested within our culture, and sometimes they can cause tensions deeply within us too. It's difficult to preach on marriage because the preacher will always know, whatever the congregation, that there will always be some in the congregation who would love to be married and aren't, and perhaps never will be, and people who were once married and no longer are. And as difficult as it is to preach on marriage, I'm sure that it can be at least as difficult for the congregation to hear. And sometimes when the message of the Bible is preached, the Holy Spirit speaks very personally to someone in a way in which the preacher has no idea. It can be wonderfully encouraging to hear the Holy Spirit speak in such a way, and it can also be very unsettling and challenging. Let's not lose sight of why the Bible teaches these things. If we were to read on in chapter 7, we would have come to verse 35, where Paul writes this. He says, I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way and in undivided devotion to the Lord. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, only mercy upon mercy and grace upon grace, continually at work to restore the image of God within us. So let's respond to all of this in prayer. Can I ask you to pray for marriages within the church? As we've seen from the wider statistics, marriage is under attack within our wider culture. And it will certainly be under attack within the church as well. Please pray for the marriages of the church leaders. They will certainly be under attack too. And let's continue to pray that the Lord would open our hearts and our minds to the glory and goodness of His Word. And let's continue to open ourselves to His mercy and His grace, so that as He works within us, we too live in a right way, in undivided devotion to the Lord. That's what it's all about. His glory, His grace, His goodness. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Let's be quiet for a moment, so that we can each respond to the Lord in our own hearts in quiet prayer, and then we'll sing again. So let's ask Grace and Jason to come back. We'll have some quietness for our own prayers, responding before the Lord, and then we'll sing.